Welcome, and thanks everyone for your patience. I hope you enjoyed visiting with the people near you. We did this in Pascal Marichalar's honor because he said this is more the French way of starting meetings. So we wanted him to feel really comfortable, and you all did a good job of not betraying anxiety. I'm really happy today that we have Pascal Marichalar here. He's a sociologist at the French National Center for Scientific Research, or CNRS, in Paris. Some of the students in the class had the chance to meet with him today and have tacos with him that I hear went well. And Pascal's research focuses on labor and occupational health. He's published extensively on occupational medicine, occupational health reform, industrial disasters, and health conditions for mine workers. And he's published mostly in French, but some in English, including the paper we're going to hear today. And I'd say it's worth learning French just to get to read the rest of his work, if you don't know it already. I met Pascal last year when we were both at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he was there along with his partner, who I was going to I'll still give a plug for, Céline Bessier, who is also a sociologist and will be speaking tomorrow in the sociology department on gender, wealth, inequality, and the family. And you all have a flyer about that talk tomorrow, and you're all welcome to join. Pascal was at the Institute for Advanced Study as well as at NYU, and he had a Fulbright at Columbia last year, researching U.S. occupational health and safety in Linden, New Jersey, for a research project entitled Managing Toxic Hazards in an Industrial Community, Linden, New Jersey, A Moral Sociology of Avoidable Disease. And we were all trying to learn from him about the place we were living because he was getting more of it than we knew. And so we're going to have him come back at some point and give us a lecture on that. But we invited him today to give a talk on his forthcoming article in a journal called History of the Present. And it builds on a monograph that he'll tell you a little bit about, and that is behind me, in French, that he recently completed and is going to be released in 3 days. So the launch party will be back in Paris, I assume. But the talk today is entitled Dying for a Living, Economic and Moral Restructuring in a French Factory. And after Pascal speaks, we have the honor of having Professor Jack Getman here, whom I hope some of you recognize. He's on the faculty of the law school at the University of Texas and is one of the country's leading labor lawyers and has written scholarly work and novels on labor law and movements. So we'll look forward to hearing from him, and then we'll take the break and have some refreshments while you think about all your hard questions, and then we'll come back. So, and as usual, the students who are now pretty much sitting in this row here will get a chance to ask the first question, and then or two, and then we'll open it up. So, thank you for being here, Pascal.
So, I'll speak like this. I hope everybody hears me. So thank you very much, Karen. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Billy, for having me and organizing my stay here. Thank you also to all students who reacted to my paper and helped better my talk by framing it better. And thank you to Jack Getman for honoring me with his discussion. So for those of you who already read the paper, which has been circulated, I will not repeat it here. And for those who haven't, I'll anyway be presenting my main argument, my methods, and fieldwork, so you won't be missing anything. So first, let me talk about the genesis of this work. So my PhD dissertation, which I defended in 2011, was about occupational medicine in France from a sociological and historical perspective. I spent a few years meeting company doctors, following them in their work, reading documents which they were able to disclose, or which I got through other means, mainly union archives. Just like here in the US, company doctors are supposed to help avoid harm to workers caused by their work. You know the Latin saying for doctors, physicians, primum non nocere, first do not harm. So this is supposed to be their main mission. But they are hired by employers, and often they tend to give priority to other goals, more short-term goals that are favored by their employers, such as seeing that workers are fit for their job, that they perform well in their job, helping to get rid of workers that are no longer fit for their job, that are not performing well anymore. Helping employers also deny that there exist any hazards in the workplace because of all the possible adverse legal consequences this could have. So my work was all about this contradiction. As you know, indignation can be a powerful drive for inquiry. And here, the fact that workers were being exposed to hazards that are known and that are avoidable, that these workers are becoming ill, injured, or dying because of this exposure, was more than enough ground for indignation, and still is a driving force of my research. In 2013, I was a postdoc engaged in a typical postdoc activity, which is looking for the next postdoc contract. So this is when I heard from a historian who works with physicians on the history of occupational disease that there were some former glassworkers who had contacted him and his team and had asked them to help document their former working conditions because they were fighting intense legal struggles in order to get compensation benefits for their occupational disease. At this very moment, I was lucky to get a permanent position at the French National Center for Scientific Research, so my present position. So this could be a research that would last longer than a postdoc. I ended up spending 4 years working with the glassworkers. So a book will be published in a few days in French. The title is Who Killed the Glassworkers of Givors? And the subtitle is A Social Science Investigation. So I was not the ideal recruit for the glassworkers from their point of view. They would have preferred working with a physician, an epidemiologist, or a toxicologist. They needed real hard science, not social science and history. Because why did they need this? Because this is what was recognized as evidence in court. However, they accepted to work with me, thinking that at least my work would probably be harmless, if not useful. And luckily, they found many great physicians who worked with them on their legal files. So my original intent was the following: to do interviews with the former glassworkers and their spouses, to study all historical documents I could get my hands on, and use this as an observatory to try to understand the social forces that allow the continued exposure of workers to hazards that are well known and avoidable. So in short, a typical industrial glass worker, while making wine bottles or jars to put jam inside, for example, is exposed to intense heat, to intense noise, to asbestos, or what has come to replace asbestos in all countries that have banned asbestos. So new fibers that are probably as dangerous as asbestos, but that haven't yet killed enough people for it to be proven statistically. So there's like a strong presumption, but we have to wait a little bit that there are more dead people, because then we're gonna get to the statistical threshold and be able to say, oh, okay, in fact, yeah, it is dangerous. They are also exposed to acid gases and to something which is well known here in Texas, which goes by the name of polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbon. In other words, the thing which gives the good smoky taste to barbecues. So now imagine working 35 years of your life inside a closed barbecue. That is that is a not too inaccurate description of the glassworkers' plight. So I believe in what one can call collaborative research, collaborative ethnography. So that is research in which you are not working on some human subjects, but with them. So this does not mean that you necessarily share all the same goals as the people you work with. It's just that you have this common interest to cooperate, but it can be for different goals. We had agreed that all the historical evidence and narratives that I helped uncover and reconstruct would then be handed over to the former glass workers. And they would then be able to possibly use them in their court cases if they felt it could be helpful. So very simply, that means if I do an interview with a glass worker about all of his life history, so I say his because these are mostly men. I interviewed just a few women. There were only a few women that worked in this plant, but so mostly men. So if I do an interview with a glass worker about his life story and his career, then I transcribe the whole interview. It'll be, let's say, 20 pages long, and I give the interview like that to the glass worker. And this can help in order to reconstruct his own history and to be able to give precise dates to the court. And I especially give them what I do when I put together the different interviews, and I'm able to reconstruct the chronology of what happened in the plant. So all of this takes place in a small town called Givors, which is in the Rust Belt, which is south of the town of Lyon. It's a place which is sometimes called the Valley of Chemistry, la Vallée de la Chimie, which is quite a bit similar to the notorious Cancer Alley that exists here in Louisiana between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. So I started my research by hanging out over there and asking the former glass workers to tell me their life story. And from the beginning, I was very surprised with what they were all telling me. I was expecting a narrative of all the hardships they had suffered. And what I got instead, first, was a nostalgic recollection of what all considered to be a great job in a great factory. Because this factory had closed 10 years before I came to Givors in 2003, despite a long struggle by the unions to keep it open. The plant's owners were a famous French food company, Danone, which before selling yogurts and famous mineral waters such as Evian, used to manufacture yogurt jars and mineral water bottles. So Danone was the major glass manufacturer in France for all of the 19th and 20th century for the food industry. Closing the Givors plant in 2003 was the last act in a decades-long move by the company away from glass containers and towards what was inside those containers. So that's when they specialized in food. The plant was profitable when it was closed, but it had to be sacrificed because competitors were only willing to buy a downsized glass division. So the Danone glass division ended up being bought by an American glass giant, which is called Owens Illinois Manufacturing. There are a lot of Owens Illinois manufacturing plants in the US and all around the world. And all that I'm going to tell you about working conditions in Givors until 2003. So these are the same working conditions with very few exceptions that exist today in Owens Illinois manufacturing plants in France, and they're the same everywhere. There's only one way of doing these kind of things. So here were people that I was meeting who were greatly attached to their former job, who had taken great pride in it, who still liked calling themselves glass workers, even after retirement, and who were at the same time denouncing the terrible working conditions to which they had been exposed, who suspected that the many cancers that were decimating their group were linked to these hazards, and who were asking for justice. So this is really a paradox for social scientists. So to illustrate, I'm going to show you some pictures that were taken about 2 months ago by a photojournalist. So for this piece that was in an online newspaper. So because the struggle of the glass workers of Givors is something that has got quite a lot of media attention in France. I mean, when I say quite a lot for this kind of topic, so it's not, not huge neither. And the photographer chose to take pictures of the main protagonists of the struggle, but asking them also to show objects that they had kept from the time that they were in the company. And the fact that they kept these objects or as kind of relics shows the attachment that they had also to the company. So here you have Mercedes Cervantes. So this is the main leader of the mobilization about industrial disease. So she is today the widow of Christian Cervantes. Christian Cervantes was leader of the main union in the plant. He was very active on different topics, and especially on the struggle against the closing of the factory. And the day the factory finally closed was a terrible day for him. And a year after the factory closed, so he was put into this kind of pre-retirement scheme, which was negotiated by the workers. So as he was over age 55, they negotiated that he would get unemployment benefits without having to look for a job. But 1 year after the factory closed, he was diagnosed with cancer, and then started a long struggle with chemotherapy, radiotherapy. Second cancer was diagnosed a few years later, etc. And he died in 2012 at age 64. And so his wife, Mercedes, she's really the one who started the struggle about occupational disease. She's the one who alerted the former glassworkers about the fact that they were all dying from cancer at young ages, and that they should be concerned about it and do something about it. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. And she's the one who started the process of what sociologist Phil Brown calls lay epidemiology, where in fact, so she's not a physician, and the people she worked with at first were not physicians, but they drafted their little version of a survey of health conditions among the former glass workers, and they showed that, so they sent it to 600 people. There were 200 people that answered, and out of the 200 that answered, there were 92 cases of cancer. And of course, this was completely unscientific, but at the same time, they thought, that's a lot. So maybe there is something here, and we should continue to struggle. There she has a picture in her hand of, so we don't see very well here, but because it was low definition pictures that I took from the internet. But this is a picture of the former plant. So this plant today has been completely demolished, except for one thing, the chimney. So we don't see very well, but the major chimney is here. And what's interesting is that this chimney has been kept as industrial heritage of the 20th century, so what's written on it. But in fact, the real reason why they did not demolish it is because it's so polluted that it would be very expensive to demolish this chimney, because they would have to then bring all the what's left over to specialized dumps for toxic products. And so you can imagine, if the chimney is polluted, that the workers that were working in the plant were also exposed to all this pollution. This is Vincent Rizzi. So Vincent Rizzi is there showing the earplugs that so he used to put against the noise. And so this is just an illustration of what prevention usually is about. So prevention of occupational hazards usually in companies, in factories like that, even when they're very dangerous, is about individual equipment to shield yourself from the hazard. But of course you cannot shield yourself so much from the hazard, and even with those earplugs, the level of sound that would get in would harm their hearing, just as they were asked to put these masks over their face, but they could not keep them, in fact, more than 5 minutes, because all the grease, the oil, the mineral oil they were using, would get stuck on it, and they couldn't see anything anymore. And it would be too hot to breathe underneath that, and they would faint, etc. So this is Jean-Claude Moyoli. So he's the head of today of the Association of Former Glassworkers of Giva. So, and there he's showing the gloves that he used to use. So at some moments, the gloves were in asbestos. So they were supposed to protect you from the fire, but they would be putting you in contact with asbestos fibers, which, as you probably all know, if you breathe in asbestos fibers, they get stuck in your lungs, and they give two kinds of diseases. One like pneumoconiosis, asbestosis, which is the lung reacting to the fibers and making it more and more difficult for you to breathe. And the other one, which is cancer, and especially pleural mesothelioma, which is a cancer which is only caused by asbestos. So, this Jean-Claude Moyoli, he had cancer recently. He was very discreet about it. It's also something which is quite startling in this struggle. is that some of them are very, very outspoken about it, and some others are very discreet about it. And even though he's the head of the organization, people learned a little bit later, after he had fought the cancer, that he had this cancer episode. So Roland Sorbier, Nicole Sorbier, and this is I don't know how you call this in English, the bleu de travail, the work clothes, that he used to have. So he was the one working in the glassworks. And here you have the wife and the husband. And as is common in a lot of these trades, the exposure to toxic products of the husband is also the exposure to toxic products of the wife. Just because this comes home often and it goes in the laundry. And so in the asbestos trials that there were in Italy recently, a lot of the victims were spouses of workers that had been exposed to asbestos just by doing the laundry. This is Joe Crozet. So if you read the paper, he's in the paper. He's the one who had a burn on his hand. And he's showing a diploma, which is a diploma for having worked a long time in the factory, which was given to him. So which is linked to a medal, which you see on this page. So this is Maurice Privat. So this is the Medal of Labor, the Medal of Work, Médaille du Travail. So it's something a bit strange, which has these kind of Vichy origins that nobody really wants to remember, honoring people that have worked for a long time in the same company, which is something which is quite rare today, of course, because turnover has increased and contracts have become shorter. So Maurice Privat has kept this, is very proud of this medal. At the same time, he is somebody who's extremely anxious, extremely depressed. He's had 2 episodes of cancer. He was able to overcome them, but he is very scared of dying, and he wrote a lot of letters, including to the president of France, about that he showed me, where he says that he's very scared of dying and that he finds something unfair has happened and that he wants justice. So I just wanted to show you this because it puts faces and you realize that these are real people. And it's not just, I mean, of course I have a theoretical argument, but I don't care so much about the theoretical argument as much as about the human element. A bit of both is always a good mix, but don't only focus on the theory. So I was saying this is an interesting paradox for social scientists, the attachment to the job and at the same time the fact that they denounce this injustice. It mirrors other paradoxes. So for example, the paradox of polluted shantytown dwellers that praise the polluting companies, as described by UT sociologist Javier Aullero, or also polluted Louisiana communities that are supporting Tea Party politicians who want to do away with the EPA, as described by sociologist Arlie Hochschild. So I decided to try to understand the rationality behind this paradox. This meant deconstructing the glassworkers' sense of justice and injustice, so as to understand how they can at the same time harbor these feelings of attachment, loyalty, pride, and indignation. So 2 concepts were important for me here. The first is the sense of injustice. So if you read great theorists such as John Rawls, Michael Walzer, you know all the discussions about what the sense of justice is about. There is an interesting essay by philosopher Judith Shklar called Faces of Injustice, which stresses the idea that collective action often is not born from a sense of justice as much as from a sense of injustice. In other words, you can feel that something is unfair, unjust, without always having a clear picture of what justice would look like. I know that here in demonstrations in the United States, you have this slogan, "This is what democracy looks like." Well, following Judith Shklar, I consider that many people engaged in collective action don't know what justice looks like. But they have a clear understanding of injustice. They have no doubt about what injustice is. So this I recognized in the glassworkers' attitudes. They felt they had been treated unfairly. They asked for justice without knowing what justice would look like. But other people had these ready-made conceptions of justice to provide to them. the state administration, legal professionals, expert physician boards, they tried to force upon them their own definition of justice. So to make it short, justice according to the state and according to the judiciary in France means mostly getting your disease recognized as an occupational disease, getting the associated benefits. And once you've been recognized as a that's the expression, getting recognition as having an occupational disease, once you get the benefits, then you're expected to shut up and stop saying you're a victim because you've been compensated. I'll get back to this in a minute and show that this doesn't completely satisfy the glass workers. The second concept which was important for me is the idea of a moral economy, which was famously described by the great British social historian E.P. Thompson. So you probably know the example he gives of famished English masses storming bread shops during the 18th century. So the poor bakers are sure they are going to get lynched, or at the least they're going to have all their bread stolen. But what happens? The crowd instead asks them to sell the bread at what it considers to be a fair price and put up a sign saying that bread will now be sold at this price and not over. So what E.P. Thompson wants to show here is that however famished, these working class crowds do not just act according to the emptiness of their stomachs. They are driven first and foremost by a sense of what is unfair, unjust, and in this case also what would be fair. Likewise, the glass workers of Giva, however harmed, injured they may be in their flesh, acted out mainly out of considerations of what they considered to be fair or unfair practices in the workplace. So this talk and my paper are a little too short to be able to describe in great detail the process of conversion that the glass workers lived through, experienced, which ultimately allowed them to feel they had the right to consider they had been victims of injustice and to ask for justice. So I will just more schematically describe two periods, two moments, before and today, and their corresponding moral economies. So the period of before is one in which glass workers felt that their employers and middle management were morally engaged in the company. They cared about the work. They cared about the workers. They wanted quality and quantity. Workers felt they were treated better than elsewhere, even if their pay was only barely higher than was the norm in other areas of manual labor. They felt there were not only financial rewards, but also symbolic rewards to their job. They confronted noble elements such as fire, sand, and water in their everyday work. They turned them into something beautiful, a glass bottle. So when you visit, I'll put this picture back, but you don't see much here. There you see especially the fog, the mist that they're in, but you also see this. So a glass factory is a very dark place, very noisy, but where it's like a volcanic eruption. Like there's all this lava going all around very fast. It's very, very beautiful. And glass bottle which has just been made is red like that and glowing, and it's really a beautiful object. And that's one of the problems. That's why people usually think that it's all very clean and pure and not dangerous. So glass workers also were in a team engaged in a fight with occupational hazards. And each member of the team always wished to be the first to perform a risky task. Not so much because of wanting to prove their manliness. That whole manliness explanation is doesn't explain so much, I think, in this example and in other cases, because the problem is that it's a tautology. It's being manly is exposing yourself to hazards, and so they expose themselves to hazards because they want to be manly, but you never get the first cause of this. What I saw in what they were telling me is more taking risks by solidarity. It's you take risks in order for your colleagues not to have to take them. Like if you're on the night shift and you're about to finish and there's something very dangerous that you have to do, or there's something very heavy like a mold that you have to change, and the molds are very heavy and they usually have to have these terrible positions to change them, they can really hurt their back, then you'll do it so that the next shift will not have to do it. That's part of the ethics of solidarity between the workers. The workers also, so they knew that there was danger lurking, but they considered this was fair also because they thought that it was being taken care of. Every hazard that could be mitigated or avoided was, in their view. So I give in my paper the example of a worker, so Joe Crozet, who burns himself severely one day in the 1980s, but waits before seeing a doctor so that it will not be considered a workplace accident and it will not cause any trouble to the company. So I must precise here, I read some student reaction papers, and I understand that for an American audience, I have to precise one thing, is that from the worker's point of view, from his point of view, the financial implications of both choices are about the same. In both cases, he will get free treatment. In one case, it is paid for by general social security, and in the other case, it's paid for by the employer and an employer mutual fund. However, by waiting to get his injury cured, he takes a great risk of harming himself in a permanent way. But Joe considers this normal. And still today, in a way, continues to say that this was normal practice. This was part of being in this company. But many things changed on the bigger scale of history. So I just would like to say, my definition of sociology is the definition, I follow the definition of sociological imagination by Charles Wright Mills, who says that sociologists are there to study the intersection between biography and history. In French also there's an expression by famous writer Georges Perec, which is, usually we say history with a small h and history with a big H to oppose like history of a person and history that we read about in history books with wars and all. And he says history, l'histoire avec une grande H, so which is a play on words. Instead of saying avec un grand H is with a big H, and avec une grande H is history with its big axe, like chopping things like that, and just like a lumberjack in the forest. And so that's the intersection that we study. So what happened, what changed in the big history? All of this started mostly in the 1980s. So these are general trends which can be observed at the national level in France, as well as in other European countries, and that mirror some trends in North America. So one of them is the rise of a new style of management, in which managers became increasingly foreign and far away from the reality of the job that was being done on the shop floor. Workers started discovering that their bosses often had no idea of what the job was about. Management started giving ritual importance to figures, charts, and these near religious protocols, which were impossible to follow if you wanted to do your job correctly. So this is something which has long been obvious in highly regulated industries, such as nuclear power plants. If workers were to follow the rules, then the plant would undoubtedly experience a severe meltdown within a few hours. They have to cheat. They have to not follow the rules in order to do their job correctly. And this has become true in many other industries. There are less regulations in these other industries, but they are replaced by these managerial slogans. So in order to perform the work, in order to do a good job, workers have to increasingly cheat on their work. That is, publicly say they are doing something, following the protocols, and in fact, doing it the other way, the way they're used to doing it, the way which works. This increasing distance between management and the reality of work is linked to financial deregulation. So in France, this happened in the 80s and mostly between 1997 and 2002 when there was a socialist government in power. This was the major period of deregulation, financial deregulation in French history in the past 40 years. New laws allowed, for example, foreign investors, including hedge funds, to take a sizable share of the companies operating in France. So in the case of Danone, Danone was a family business for the previous 6 generations. And what happened at the end of the 1990s, Franck Ribou, the then owner of the company, chose to partner with CVC Capital Partners, a major private equity firm, for a financial scheme which is called a leveraged buyout, an LBO. And this is what killed the glassworks of Givors, even though the factory was doing very well. Because new investors, they asked for high and quick return on investment, and this meant asking impossible things from workers. So just to give you a sense of this disconnect between what is asked from workers and the reality of work, I can give you a story of a year ago approximately. I was walking around a glassworks in France. So officially as I was supposed to be the cousin of the main union delegate. It is a factory which is owned by Owens Illinois Manufacturing, and it's one of the former Danone plants that survived the LBO ritual sacrifice. And what I can tell you, which was very surprising, was to see these workers, so in their grimy, hot, noisy shop floor, in this factory, which is in a remote mountain area, so near Clermont-Ferrand, for those of you who know France a little bit. They were sipping their coffee in a break room, which was covered with English language posters telling them to improve their JCI, Job Change Index, or their PCM, Pack to Melt Index. And none of these workers speaks English. But when they say these acronyms, they do say them in an English way. So it's on est à quel JCI là? Il faut améliorer le PCM. They say it in an English way. But in interviews, they all tell me that these indexes that are imposed on them by the managers today are, pardon my French, as you say, bullshit, which come from American managers that have no idea of the conditions needed to produce a nice quality bottle. So understand, it's not about being American here. It's about these managers not even taking the moment to consider that these workers do not speak English, and that putting up these posters in the break room has absolutely no effect. So other things have changed in this historical period. The collapse of Marxist ideology, or of the legitimacy, let's say, of Marxist ideology. The collapse of collectives that lived on these ideas. Attacks against organized labor. So I don't have time to get into all the details, but you get the general picture, because the decline of labor as a political force on the shop floor and on the national level is also an American phenomenon. So now I come to the second period, today. So today, the glassworkers have come to the conclusion that for many decades, the only people who have had a genuine interest in the factory's success have been themselves. Closing a profitable factory was the major blow. It shattered their idea that they were recognized for the good work they were doing. And glassworkers that I met all speak of a letter which was written a little after the decision to close the factory was announced, and their struggle started to keep the factory open. So it's a letter written by the owner, Franck Ribou of Danone, to the French Minister of Justice, in which he says, media accounts have spoken of the struggle of these glassworkers against the Danone company, which owns the factory, but we have nothing to do with this factory. This is now owned by a Luxembourg firm, which is property of CVC Capital Partners, etc. And so all of a sudden, the factory that had been in the family for approximately 200 years, they had nothing to do with it, and it was as if they had never had anything to do with it. This infuriated the glassworkers. And to give you a sense of their attachment to the glassworks, they did a lot of effort to make sure that the machines were never going to be harmed, that the ovens were never going to be stopped, because then they would have to be demolished. So this first injustice brought them to question the whole moral implicit contract that had governed their working life. This questioning was made first by the female spouses of this mostly male workforce. So people like Mercedes Cervantes. So one of the questions I ask is why is it that the women played the major role in starting the struggle about occupational disease? This is also something that you can see in struggles about environmental pollution. So there's a very good article by Phil Brown and Faith Ferguson on the 90s in Gender and Society, I think, which is called Making a Big Stink, and which is about this. It addresses this issue of why is it that all environmental pollution struggles are led by women. And I can come back to this in the questions, but in a way, I'll say that in these patriarchal families, in which everything was around the man and his work, and all the friends of the family were the friends of the man, the husband, etc. And women had to do a lot of sacrifices in order to keep the house running and in order for conditions to be best for their husband, who was tired by his work, etc. And so they would take care of the kids, they would take care of everything. They were the ones who were least profiting from the implicit moral contract. But they anyway adhered to it, they anyway stuck to it for some time. But the minute they started seeing that, in fact, maybe this had been unfair from the beginning, I mean, they were the first to see that, let's say, that they had been unfair. And then starting to realize that maybe all the sacrifices that they had done had been in vain, because one of the things that they had done the sacrifices for was to guarantee, to uphold the manly representation of their husbands that the husbands wanted to project. And of course, when people like Christian Cervantes, so Mercedes' husband, who was very much like a manly union leader, so he had a mustache, everybody called him Asterix because he looked like Asterix, and because he was always very angry, getting angry very easily, and that he was like Asterix, the comic book hero, always fighting and going ahead in adventures, etc. So the day he got operations to cure his cancer, then all of a sudden he couldn't speak distinctly, half of his face was gone, etc. And he became a very weak person who was always, I mean, his wife had to take care of him for everything, bring him to the bathroom, etc. for years and years and years. And so in a way, I understood this one day in a collective interview with many widows of deceased glass workers. They're saying that their job in this struggle was upholding the manly image of their husbands. It's well, this struggle, they're going to win it too. They're dead now, but they're going to win it ultimately, like they won the other struggles before. So I'm going to try and wrap this up quickly, but as you can imagine, there are a lot of law students and legal scholars here, so when something is considered unfair, you turn to the justice system. So I'll just briefly discuss some legal elements about this topic. So the question of working conditions, you can get to it from many different angles. One of them is the angle of contract, saying there's a contract between the employer and the employee. And in let's say a neoliberal worldview, liberal comes from liberty, freedom, and so this idea that everybody's free to do whatever. And so there's this idea that there's equal bargaining power. And so workers and employers, while they choose to have a contract where one is going to give some work and the other is going to give some wage against this work. So from this point of view, there can be an idea that risk is compensated by salary. That, well, you knew when you were signing up that you were going to be exposed to this. And so you should not feel that something is unfair about this. So this, in France, I don't know so much about the United States. This in France is not really something that works in the legal arena. It means that employers that say, well, you knew that you were going to be exposed to hazard in this job. This doesn't work as a legal argument, but it works as a moral argument. And so that has a lot of importance anyway. That means that all the environment of the workers that are exposed to hazard will always be thinking that, telling that, now you knew that it was dangerous, and so why are you complaining about it now? And it's going to be an easy way also to try and blame the workers by, for example, saying, well, you're just in it for the money now. you just want to find some compensation. You need money, and so you're just. That's why you're starting to say that you are indignant about something which you accepted for so many years. But this does not work so much as a legal argument, because we have this law in France since the end of the 19th century that says that employers have to provide a safe, healthy workplace to employees. And this is something which is in ILO conventions. And so it's usually about this that legal arguments are. But so a major thing that has to be kept in mind is that all these issues in France, as like in other European countries, and in some respects like in the United States, these matters are never criminalized. That means that, so one example I often give in classes is, you invite people to your place, you give them something to eat from a can which is 20 years old, and you don't know if it's really gonna kill them or not. And so, well, too bad, half of them die from this can. Well, if ever there's a police investigation, and so they realize it comes from the can, and on top of it they realize that you knew that maybe this was dangerous, and that you anyway gave this to your guests, then you're gonna have some problems with justice. If you do this as an employer, and you're exposing employees to a hazard, which, for example, is going to, there's a 2% chance of developing a certain type of cancer, you're not going to have any problems. It's never going to be treated as a criminal case. It's only treated as a criminal case in France if there's a major industrial disaster that looks like an explosion. I mean that it has to be like in the news, very visible, a lot of dead people at the same time. There they have to do something. So, for example, in 3 days, there's going to be the verdict for a very big industrial disaster that happened in France 10 days after 9/11 in the town of Toulouse. A very big chemical plant that exploded. 30 people died, 20 workers and 10 people in the surrounding communities. So there they had to do a major criminal trial. But usually when it's industrial disease, you don't see it. And people, they die at different stages. And you need a huge work, historical work, medical work, to show that there has been a disaster, that all these people are part of the same disaster. So usually what happens is that legal cases focus only on compensation, civil compensation. And an idea that has been introduced at the end of the 19th century in most European countries and in the 1910s and 20s in some US states is this idea that this compensation should not be full compensation of all the prejudice that has been experienced by the workers, but should be some kind of, so I don't need to say forfait in English, like a fixed sum that has been predetermined and which covers only part of the prejudice. So in France, it's supposed to cover half of the salary you lost. So for example, if you cannot work anymore because of your occupational injury, then you're going to get a monthly payment of half of the salary you would have made if you had continued working. Why half? Because the idea is that they give out this compensation, the compensation board give out this compensation quite easily if the accident happened at work. You don't have to prove too much. So in exchange for this ease, you only get half. And for occupational disease, it's much more complicated because you have to prove that your disease is this particular kind of disease and that it has been caused by this kind of exposure in this kind of company. It becomes much more complicated, and you have this kind of issue here too. But so as I was telling you, the idea of justice, which is always being shown to the former glass workers, is justice is getting your disease recognized as occupational disease. So there's nothing about criminal justice. So I know that Karen, for example, she has written a lot about human rights organizations, activists that are asking for criminal sanction, criminal punishment, and that this is not always a good solution, or this can cause other problems, let's say, in the human rights agenda. But in this case, you can see that the expressive function of punishment doesn't exist at all. There is nothing. At no moment does any judge say, you're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to expose people to something which is going to kill like 10% of them or whatever. So to conclude, so this is, sorry if this is going a bit in all directions at the end, but I want to say that this is not a description of the French working class. This is a description of what is left of the most privileged and protected group in the French working class. So to explain what I mean, you maybe know this description by economists Pure and Doringer of the segmented labor markets. The idea of that there are two labor markets. So this was a book that they wrote in 1970 for I don't know which federal administration in the United States. So they describe two labor markets in the United States. The first labor market is one with mostly big companies, unions, benefits, salaries that are higher than average, benefits that are not only about money. So in the French case, for example, I describe it in the paper, we have this thing called comité d'entreprise, which is kind of a mutual fund which has to be, that the company has to pay money to regularly, and which is used to finance, subsidize, for example, holidays for the workers or for their kids. Like in big companies in France, it's very common that you send your kids off to summer camps that are really cheap because it's according to your income, and the difference is subsidized by the comité d'entreprise. In this first labor market, there's also the idea of long-term employment, training, and the high salaries are warranted by the fact that because you have been trained, the company doesn't want to lose you right away. They have to keep you, because otherwise it's going to cost money to train somebody else. The second labor market is one of smaller companies, no unions, no benefits, wages that are at the minimum regulatory level, short-term contracts, and an idea of totally replaceable workers. So, and absolutely no progression in the salary and the wage during your life. Like you can finish your career at exactly the same salary as when you started. So this description works perfectly well for France too, and for France today. A recent study by the French Institute of Statistics showed that that these two worlds were growing farther and farther apart, and that being able to go from the secondary labor market to the primary one is becoming increasingly difficult. It was never easy, but it's very, very difficult today. One of the reasons of that is because the people that are in the primary labor market, for example, that have a long-term contract, they tend to cling to their job, even if it's terrible, even if they find the working conditions are not good, or they don't get along with their boss or whatever, because they're so scared of falling in the other category. So this first world is disappearing little by little under the assault of neoliberal policies. And the glass workers of Givors represent what is left of this first world. So they do not represent the majority of the working class. So to describe the situation in the majority of the working class, I'm going to read from a book which I bought here, which is about here. So Invisible in Austin, which was made by a team of sociology students under the direction of Javier Auyero, so at the sociology department, which I highly recommend. So it's about unskilled laborers in Austin that do all the odd jobs and that live in the parts of the city that are not trendy or weird or anything like that. And so I'm going to read the afterword by Loïc Vacant, who's a sociologist. So he writes, precarity breeds misanthropy and erodes mutual identification and reciprocity, which are the preconditions for solidarity. It feeds a suffusive sentiment of indignity among the dispossessed. In an era that has witnessed both the dismantling of traditional institutions of working class defense, such as unions, and the universalization of the school-mediated mode of reproduction, today's lower-tier workers have no reliable sources of collective pride to draw upon. So they come to view their kind, if not themselves, as lacking in worthiness. They are not just politically expendable and culturally invisible, they are also socially dishonored. And he also writes a little bit farther. By contradistinction to the industrial proletariat, consolidating over the long century, beginning in 1870, which grew both more numerous and more cohesive by forging a collective identity as proud builders of the world, the post-industrial precariat is a stillborn group, a dispersed collection of disparate categories, riven by fissiparous impulses and centrifugal tendencies, as everyone yearns to escape, not join it. So I think I find this description really very brilliantly synthetic about a lot of things that I can see in France. And so I see that apparently it's also the case here in Austin. And I would like to end by two things. So I think that people, whatever their job, and even when they're very badly paid and very badly treated, they usually like doing the job well. So I think this was not maybe, I didn't explain this very well in my paper, because a lot of students that sent reactions, they wrote that they didn't understand this idea of commitment to the company, that this was probably a French idea, but here in the United States, nobody was committed to the company, and that you just did it for the pay, and then you changed. And I was not saying the company, in fact. I mean, it can be the company sometimes, but I was saying the job, like the idea of doing your job well. You can see this. It has been shown in very many sociological investigations. The idea that even jobs that look terrible and degrading, people are going to find a way of trying to do it well. And so they put, as we say, I don't know if you say that in English, they put a part of themselves in the job. It's not just, they cannot stay completely detached. And usually for it to work, they have to do that. Another thing I want to say is that the focus on health in the collective action against industrial disease is a way also of bringing back the idea of human dignity. The idea of human dignity that is lost in the contemporary organization of the working class as described by Loïc Vacan. So bringing back this sense of dignity is a precondition that then allows the building of new forms of solidarity and collective action. Well, thank you very much. I don't know how it works. I'm not the boss. So
Thank you. I'll try to be brief so that you can ask your questions. First of all, I want to commend Pascal for telling the story from the perspective of workers and for talking to the workers. And I think that what is most often missing from labor discussions and articles and scholarship is the voice of the worker. I've tried to put it in my own scholarship, and I'm pleased to see that Pascal is using it. In addition, almost everything that he said is equally true about workers in the United States. There is a similarity that is really remarkable and suggests really the basis for a kind of worker solidarity. The business, by the way, about liking what looks to most of us as terrible jobs is almost is ubiquitous. When I did a study of union organizing many, many years ago, we did a job index, a job satisfaction index. And we asked people, you know, do you like the work? And we always got yes. Remarkable the extent to which 95% of people liked the work. A lot of them didn't like the jobs because they were being mistreated, they didn't like supervision, they didn't like the pay. But the work itself, people find ways of liking their work, even law students on occasion. So that part is true. And when he talked about the glassblower, I was really struck because I did a book about paper workers in the town of Jay, Maine, which it had very many similarities. And in fact, it would be a close battle about which worked under more unsafe conditions. Paper mills, as those of you who've ever been near a paper mill know, exude sulfur dioxide. There's a smell that extends, many miles from any paper mill. And the workers at Jay knew that this was injurious to their health. They called it the smell of money for a long time. And every other aspect of making paper has health hazards that go with it, which the workers knew. And actually, many of the people that I interviewed and who conducted a rather remarkable strike are now dead from various health hazards of making paper. It was at a point, what was different in Jay was not the workers were absolutely committed not only to the work, but to the International Paper Company. They wore jackets. They described themselves as, I'm a company man, I'm a company woman. You wondered why. But at the point at which International Paper decided to change things by bringing in modern sociological concepts of work, is where the workers revolted, and they also tried to cut pay. So we ended up with a strike, which was a tremendous and effective strike, which was undercut by a variety of terrible, the law, their own national union combined to destroy the strike. But during the strike, curiously, they changed the town got together and changed the rules about having plants that polluted the air. So they set up their own EPA. It was very tricky, but they did it. And when the strike ended, they refused to go back to where it was. At one time, it was the smell of money, but after a strike which brought on the solidarity of the workers, they wouldn't take it any longer. And as is also true of the glass blowers, the paper workers at Jay, once they developed a really very moving solidarity, it was, for many of them, the great moment of their life. This was over 30 years ago, somebody just sent me an article from the Maine newspaper, and there was one of the women strikers, and how she remains totally committed to the union, to what they fought for, and to the sense of solidarity, which, if you were there, you could touch it, you could feel it. There is that possibility that still exists. It is true that the part of the workforce which is subject to unions, which is open to unions, is reduced. It is also the case that unions are no longer the force that they were. But the truth of it is, despite all the flaws of unions in the United States, they really created something very effective, and we miss it. We miss it politically, we miss it culturally, and we miss it in terms of any sense of economic justice. So it was not without, I believe that these kind of new ways of work were in fact union busting techniques when and they actually tried to get the union people to train their own replacements, which I won't go into. And I won't retell that story, but I am struck by how similar it is, including the health and mortality issues that were raised. But the one thing that was actually different is that there remains in the workers of J, I'm not sure if this is true, Pascal, a sense of having fought and having developed a sense of comradeship with each other that is absolute, has never left them. That's what that woman's story 30 years later was. So I think the research that Pascal is doing is excellent. I think it's good that he has talked to the workers and brings their perspective in. And I think that it's not all that different in the United States. Everything I heard were, yep, that was true of Jay, yes, that's true of other workers, and so on. So there should be a bond among workers really across national lines, because what they face is so similar.
Yes, so thanks to both of you very much. And we have a microphone, right?
Yeah,
It's going to be at the, but if everybody goes for the food at once, I'm just going to be standing over here. So maybe this table could get up and move while you're starting to respond. And should we do that? So, yeah, so you can go back now. And you can respond to Jack briefly, and then we'll open it up. Yeah, so go ahead, and they'll all get on the camera.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much, Jack, for this discussion. So I have two things it makes me think of two things. The first is when you speak of these new ways of work, these new, inspired from sociology, or some kind of sociology, that are used as union busting, techniques. Of course, this makes me think of the classic sociological work written in 1999 by two French sociologists, Luc Boltanski and Eve Capello, called The New Spirit of Capitalism, and which is a very interesting thing about how after May 68, and let's say all the 60s movements for justice and equality in different fields, this was imported into management, and you can see a shift in management techniques just from the books that managers read and the training they get, where the idea of having work which would be fulfilling, which would be enriching, and that would help each individuality express his or her own self was developed. So, and that you have to end all hierarchical idea of work with like bosses and bigger bosses and smaller bosses, etc., and have it all horizontal. So I mean, this is an idea of work which you know, because I mean it's very common today, and it's a lot in the media, like about like high-tech companies such as Facebook or Google, etc. And of course, whenever you're a sociologist coming to study that behind, usually you're there to find all the hierarchy that has been hidden not very well behind all this horizontal thing. And so, of course, these are union busting techniques in a way, because by focusing everything on the individual, in order to say that individuals should fulfill themselves in their work, they are individualizing everything about labor and taking away the conditions for collective action, usually. Another example is having individualized salaries in a company for a same position, or in a university. Like I know that in American universities, salaries are not the same for the same position. Depends on the bargaining power of each university professor. In France, we still have this public university system where we all get the same salary. And so it's not very high, but the good side about it is that you're not fighting about that with your colleagues. You're fighting about a lot of other things. But at least you're not fighting about that, and you can get together collectively on certain topics. Another thing I wanted to tell you. So you were saying that you were impressed by the sense that they had of having fought something together and the way it created comradeship. I read history article, which was written in 1980 by this social historian in France called Yves Lequin. So for those who know a bit of social history, he's also part of the, let's say, E.P. Thompson legacy, or Joan Scott, or Michel Perrault, another feminist historian. And so he wrote the major book on the history of the Lyon area, so this industrial area, formerly industrial area. And he has a part about the glassworkers of Givors. And I really fell from my chair, as we say in French, because of surprise. Because he was saying, the glassworkers of Givors, there's absolutely no collective. It's totally individualized workers. Compared to the steel workers of Givors, that was the other big factory, absolutely no sense of the collective. So I was very surprised seeing that, saying, wow, that's so much the opposite of what I see. And in fact, what I realized is that maybe they went a bit, maybe it's a bit exaggerated what they said, but at the same time, it's the fight against the closing of the factory, which lasted a year and a half. That's the major thing that created the collective. And after that, they wanted to continue remaining in that collective. And this whole thing that I described to you, this whole struggle about industrial disease, it's all was made possible because of one mistake of the former employer, which is that when they negotiated the closing of the factory, so there was a negotiation, the workers saying, okay, we're going to stop blocking everything and the strike and all, but if we get certain benefits, etc. And they asked for one thing. They said, we want to continue getting the mutual complementary health insurance, which came with this job. But for that, we need to have we need to have an organization of former glassworkers. So this will be the organization that will be giving out this health insurance. And it has to have some headquarters. So they asked for a small apartment, a small bit of housing, in order to put the headquarters of the organization. And the company gave it. Said, okay. And they gave it for like €1, like the symbolic euro, as we say. And so they set up this organization of former glassworkers. As they all wanted to continue getting this mutual health insurance, they all remained part of this, but they also remained part of this because they were so happy going there every Friday, every Saturday, because activities were organized. They were continuing the activities that had taken place during the struggle against the closing. And till today, I was telling you about subsidized holidays. Till today, they do subsidized holidays all together during the summer. They go like 1 week on the beach on the Mediterranean. And so when I say subsidized, they subsidize it between themselves. For example, the widows get a lower price even if they take a single room because the others pay for that. So they have this kind of system of solidarity. And it's because they maintained this organization and because they continued seeing each other, because they were so happy to continue seeing each other after the factory closed, that they realized that they were all getting these cancers and that they were able to do the health survey and send it to all of them because they had the addresses, because all the addresses were up to date because they had to be for the mutual health insurance. So that's all I wanted to react to. Thank you.
So I realize that the people would be next to get the food because I'm going to do it. I also get to ask the first question. So anyone in the class?
The book Strangers in Their Own Land. I'm curious if there's any analogy between some of what the author discusses in that book and your work. Particularly, she talks a lot about something that seems sort of an oxymoron to progressives, which is the environmentalist Tea Party activist in Louisiana. But she explains that through explaining the relationship of the worker to the state. Is there any sort of analogy to be made for you in your work? And I'm not sure if you had reviewed the book recently, but my recollection is that what she says is that as a result of this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where there's politicians elected on a platform of maligning the government and then go to defund it, thus proving themselves correct when it becomes ineffective, that the workers then become Tea Party activists. They don't see a government that's investing in their community or that's able to respond to their cries for help or clean up the environment. And so she sort of explains the weak relationship to the state as how you could have someone that's both an environmentalist and a Tea Party activist. Is that totally irrelevant for your work, or is there some element of the relationship between the workers and the state that impacts how they view their own work in their company?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a good memory of that book. And so, let's say, well, the first thing I'll say is that the situation of the relationship of citizens to the state in France is very, very different from what you can have in the United States. So that's the first thing, is that here in the United States, there is like a very profound distrust of anything which is linked to the state among a lot of right-wing people, but also among a lot of left-wing people. You'll not find that in France like that. You'll find the contrary. Let's say you'll find among left-wing people and right-wing people, people that like the state or that turn to the state for different reasons. But for example, the Gaullist tradition, exemplified by General de Gaulle, is like right-wing conservative version of a strong state. So that being said, in this case, in the case of the former glass workers, I don't see this at all. But this is because these are really, as I was telling you, this is the dying working class of before and of the primary labor market. They have strong ties to all these former communist networks. So the Communist Party in France, has been a very, very strong political force, especially after the Second World War, in the years after the Second World War, and structured all the way the labor market worked. And the strongest union till today is the CGT, which is the union which was historically linked to the Communist Party. And it's very, because of all these links, they're not going to start going against, let's say, the state, because the state is a big part of the communist project. What I recognize in that book of Arlie Hochschild, from what I've seen in Givor, is the way institutions of the state, parts of the administration, can discredit themselves, even though people are in favor of the principle of their action. And for example, labor inspectors, but also it also works for environmental regulation. They tend to be very, very weak. There's no, the enforcement is very difficult because there are very few inspectors, very little enforcement, etc. And so they tend to focus, as I was telling students at lunchtime, on paperwork. And this is something that has been shown in historical studies in the 19th century in Britain. The creation of the labor inspectorate was a moment where I think at the beginning there was only 4 or 5 labor inspectors for all of Britain. And so of course they realized quite fast that they were not going to be able to go and inspect all the factories. So they decided to set up all these new regulations about registries of workers and stuff like that. And so they would instead inspect the registry. And that's something which is quite common. It's when you go on the EPA website, or when you used to go on the EPA website, so I don't know what's left of the EPA website. There used to be like these huge sheets of data of like polluting emissions from factories. So like in this factory in this town, that's so much of the sulfur dioxide, so much of this, so much of that. And like these unreadable things, you have to be an expert to understand something about it. And what's the terrible thing that they do all this work to make the data sheet, but then they don't do anything about it. And so environmental activists are pissed off, and employers are pissed off. And people that are for deregulated big business are pissed off, because they say, well, what's the point of all this? And that you can see. You can see the former glass workers having this kind of, this is called the anti-fonctionnaire mindset in France, like the anti-civil servant mindset. Like a lot of people are against civil servants. They're for their state, against civil servants. But they're for hospitals, for schools, but But they don't like civil servants because civil servants are lazy people that don't do anything, etc. You know, and but the minute the hospital there's not enough doctors in it or the school not enough teachers, then all of a sudden they're what? That's a scandal, and they turn to the state saying you have to fix this. So that's the kind of contradiction I would see.
Let me indicate if you have a question, just a general.
Well, first, thank you for coming. In the article what you described to us about the moral, you called it the moral restructuring that happened with the workers. I'm kind of curious, and I posed the question. I don't know if you'd previously seen it, if Dr. Ingold even submits our questions, but
I saw a lot of things.
oh, great.
I'm not supposed to say exactly all I saw, but I saw a lot.
I posed the question of what about the moral restructuring on the part of the Dannon owners? Because I think the main argument, you focus on the workers, but I'm also curious on the other end of if there was or if you saw any actual moral restructuring that happened on the part of the people that own the factory. And I would hope, that there is some evidence of something that these people just didn't immediately go from this was our 200-year legacy of our factory to writing that letter to the Justice Ministry, that was sort of, we have no connection to this whatsoever. So could you kind of speak to the moral restructuring that took place on that end as well, and how that also kind of impacted the engagement with the workers?
Yes. So it's difficult for me to answer this because I didn't I didn't do interviews with management of the company, the owners. It would have been difficult for me to do both field works at the same time because as you can understand, this is like kind of sensitive things. So if you go see the manager and then the glass workers know that you saw the manager, the owner, they're going to feel distrustful, and same thing the other way. But what I can tell you is that what I know from what I read is that the big difference in the case of Danone is between the figure of Antoine Ribou, who is the owner between the 60s and the 90s, and his son Franck Ribou. And Franck Ribou became the owner of Danone in the middle of the 90s and who just announced he was retiring like 5 days ago. Not because of my book, I hope. But so I don't think we academics have that much power. The difference between the two, I think, is there should be there must be investigations about this that show it better. It's a question of training. Like the son was sent all around the world in these elite institutions of higher education, and he got this kind of world training that not specifically linked to any kind of national tradition, contrary to his father. And so the financialization of economy, of capitalism, which made that the son embraced this much more than the father. And at the same time, as you know, there are anyway some tools that are used by top management to show that they do keep some kind of moral attachment or moral link to what's happening in the company. So these are the same years where the development of the idea of sustainable development. Do you know who the main promoter of the idea of sustainable development is? So it's a guy called Stefan Schmidheiny. So this is really very funny. He's the major asbestos manufacturer in the world until the 1980s, the end of the 1980s. In fact, his father, Max Schmidheiny, so he had an asbestos cement huge group, so it's a Swiss family. When they split the inheritance, he gave cement to Thomas Schmidheiny and asbestos to Stefan, too bad. And Stefan Schmidheiny is one of the people that was, he was condemned to 18 years of jail in the Torino asbestos mega trials a few years ago, which were ultimately cancelled for a question of statute of limitations. But let's say the trials that were on the, not on the formal part, but on what really happened, they convicted him, they condemned him for exposing thousands of people to risk in his companies and around the companies. And he was, the charges were that 3,000 people had died because of this negligence. So Stefan Schmidheiny, at one moment, got rid of the asbestos business and started like reorganizing and going towards other kind of fibers and other kinds of construction materials. And at the same time, he exiled himself to Costa Rica and he started writing all these books about sustainable development. And he's one of the main guys who was behind the first Rio conference in '92 about climate. And so, I mean, just to say that I think this is a sincere person. When you read all the interviews and you write, he was very pained by all that happened that was bad about asbestos. And then he wanted to make amends. And so he developed this whole thing about sustainable business and all. But this kind of idea of sustainable development and the idea of corporate social responsibility, etc., are used, of course, as also things that show that, well, this is being taken care of. And in fact, underneath, nothing much is changing. So I would say, I don't want you to get the impression from my talk that I'm saying that employers are mean people that want to kill their workers. I mean, some do, but they're rare. Most people don't want, and most people don't even think they're killing the workers. And I did not study that side, so I cannot say much more about this. But I think they do keep some kind of moral engagement, but from a distance. A bit like, I don't know, when you would be, when you're far from, when you have kids and you're far from your kids, you try and send them gifts or whatever to show that you're anyway with them. Or when you, I don't know, you hire somebody to clean your house, you try and clean it a little bit before so that it'll be less work, and so you'll say that you're not paying the person too badly or whatever. So,
You know, what
Yeah.
I find is, and I've interviewed many employers, is that they in fact have their own set of ethics, a significant amount of which comes from the University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, which is the idea that if you're a corporation, your primary responsibility, in fact, virtually your sole responsibility, is to the shareholders. So anything that advances the interests of shareholders is sort of by definition morally upright. In addition to which, it's very easy to convince yourself that by doing things that you think are in the interest of the corporation, you're actually helping the workers. Anybody with half of a brain and half of a conscience can come up with that.
Which is actually an important part of the economic restructuring in your story too.
moral commitment to shareholders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is more and more the legal requirement. Great. Any other questions? Okay, Cassidy, and then I see your hand. And spread it around. Okay. And you all should come get food if you haven't yet.
Hi, thanks for coming. So one of the things you mentioned was that it wasn't so much masculinity as it was this taking risk for solidarity idea. And I was just wondering that you saw that idea manifest itself when they were still working in the factory, but how did that taking risk for solidarity move into the mobilization for justice?
So, if I understand your question, let's say, for example, in the courtroom, you'll see a lot of people doing a lot of work for their colleagues, their former colleagues, in order to help them for their legal case. Like the more able or the more skilled ones helping the other ones. Is that what you mean? Or
I guess kind of, but you know, these people were, in your article I noticed that people were, you know, having to kind of swallow their pride to get some help as far as, I know when the individuals went to the doctor and the doctor said like, oh,
yeah.
you just need money, right?
Yeah.
People were kind of having to swallow their pride to pursue this legally.
Yeah.
And so like, did you see that idea of solidarity kind of help the workers mobilize because they were all willing to swallow their pride? Or?
Yeah. Oh yeah, so definitely. So for example, Christian Cervantes, he did not want at first to follow his wife's idea of doing this survey and starting this mobilization. And he ultimately entered this struggle because people told him this was going to be useful for other people, for other colleagues. And they're all saying that. And they're all saying it's not for me, it's for the others. And so this is something you see very often in these kind of struggles, where also people, they don't want, when they go to court, they ask for €1 of compensation because they want to show that it's not for the money, that they're doing this for principle. So there are two things that say it's principle. We want some kind of responsibility to be adjudicated like on principle, and at the same time, we want to set a precedent for other people, for workers, for former colleagues, that will be easier for them to get their disease recognized after, or for the glass workers of today that are also still being exposed to the risks. So they very much think about this. And this is all, as I said at the end of the paper, this you can see in even just the everyday life of this mobilization, where people are always asking me, like, this must be very depressing to work on this, you know, my friends, my family. And I during the 4 years of the research, I was telling them that actually not so much. There's so much energy, and they're so happy to see each other all the time. I would do these interviews with people that are dying. They're all like 5 people around a table, and they're so happy to just be all around the same table and to be speaking about all the jokes and all the stuff and all that happened. And when they go to court together, it's the same kind of thing. It's this. So, I mean, there are tragic moments. But at the same time, there is a lot of joy also of just being together and doing it all together. And one thing that was very tangible, like in the court cases, is for one of the things that they did, one of the cases that they started, they ask compensation. So it's workers that are not sick that ask compensation for their anxiety at the idea of getting sick. It's the only, they're trying to find any way to get some kind of justice. So that's the way that a lawyer came up with, and which has worked for like 5 years, and now it's not working anymore because the Supreme Court, I mean, the Cour de Cassation in France, they closed it. But so in order to do that, they had to have a testimony from former colleagues of what were their working conditions, and so about the past, and also about the present, about the fact that today they are depressed, they are anxious, they are scared, etc. And so you have all these great documents that they showed me, where it's one of them saying, I worked with this guy for like 20 years, we did this, we did that, we did that. Today we're still friends, we see each other every weekend when we go play football, and I see that he's very, very anxious. He's always taking these pills, he doesn't sleep at night, he's always looking on the internet for these strange names of cancers that maybe could be related to what he's been exposed to, etc. And then the other guy does the same for him. And so you got all these, you can do like network analysis. I mean, I'm not so much into network analysis because once you have the network, I don't know what to do with it. But you can just see that it's all interrelated in all directions. So that's one of the manifestations of the solidarity today.
I have so many questions, but I'm just going to ask one. If you were to have an input in the financial modeling process for an LBO, what would you say as a consultant? You know what I mean?
Well, that's a. So what do you mean? But in order to do what?
I guess in order to avoid some of the ills that you've observed in the course of your research.
Okay. Well, I would not be a consultant in LBOs because I would consider that this kind of thing should not be allowed.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Yes. Justice is getting your disease recognized as an industrial disease, is what you said. It paints a very restrictive picture of what kind of justice these people can look to, because it shifts the burden back to them to prove or to try to prove that they are entitled to compensation and all these things. Do you know whether there is anything being done either from the part of the government or from the part of interest groups to try to reform such a situation so that if other people are afflicted by this way, they will have some form of redress beyond merely recognizing their disease?
Um, these issues that I've spoken about are not at all present in any political debate in France. Let's say, even there is a debate about working conditions, bad working conditions, and like the victims of bad working conditions speaking up and saying like this is not be allowed. For example, a month ago in France, on TV, they have this kind of it's a bit like 60 Minutes, I think here. I mean, it's kind of news report that a lot of people watch, and which was where they had hidden cameras in different companies, and they showed the terrible working conditions in these companies that are like major French companies. And this was like one of the most watched TV programs ever in France, and a lot of people spoke about it after, and you feel that this topic of working conditions is very, very strong. But then the idea of what is justice, and that's not dealt with at all, because most of the victims, they usually enter this struggle for justice, and then they make their own, this idea that justice is getting your disease recognized as an occupational disease. And so it's going to be a very difficult struggle, and the day that it's recognized, if they're lucky, because it's a lot about luck, because all of this has nothing much to do with science, because you cannot prove the individual causal link between exposure and cancer. That's impossible. So it's all a lot about luck, media coverage, and like which judge was there that day. So if they're lucky, then they're going to say, this is victory. We won. And I have debates with activists on working conditions in France. But saying, well, maybe we should be thinking also about like, what is the objective? Is it just that? You think really that is victory? Does that change something? And this is a debate which does not exist very much in France at the moment. And as for reforming working conditions, as I told you, a lot of people in France speak about it. There's going to be a major criminal trial next year about suicides in France Télécom, which was the public telecommunications company in France, where it was a public company because of European regulations. They had to become a private company. But the problem is that they had like 20,000 civil servants working in there, or even more. And they wanted to get rid of them, but they could not fire them. So what they did is they implemented a kind of management where the idea was to have them quit. So it was like telling people, okay, as of tomorrow, you're going to be working 500 kilometers away from here. Or as of tomorrow, you have nothing to do. Or otherwise, we have taken away your chair. There will be no more chair in your office, and no more telephone, and no more nothing, and you have nothing to do. And waiting for the person to quit. And so, like, what was the outcome of that? It's like 50 people at least committed suicide, leaving suicide notes saying this is because of France Télécom, this is terrible. So that's going to be an interesting criminal trial, if it ever comes, because it can still be cancelled. But so what I'm saying is that we speak a lot about this in France. It's the only way to speak about work today, is to speak about working conditions. Because the whole debate otherwise is parasited, I don't know if you say that, by the question of employment. As the focus is always on employment, it's very difficult to speak about work, what's happening in work. But we speak about that. But then is there any public policy about that or political will? What I can tell you is the new president, Macron. So from the United States, I know that if you read the New York Times, Macron is like really this great guy, very modern and young and all. And so a lot of people in France don't have the same view. What I can tell you is that among all the former presidents, including Sarkozy, none has so little to say about working conditions as Macron. And the labor, you heard about these, maybe the labor reforms that he just implemented there this summer, without submitting them to a vote of parliament. So he did kind of an executive order because he knew that it was going to be otherwise a very difficult debate in parliament. One of the things he did is that he just cancelled the only thing that was working in France, which was so it's called the Committee on Hygiene and Working Conditions and Security in the Workplace. So every company had to have that. And it was a place where was like union people that would come there and speak about all the hazards, all the accidents, all the disease, and what should be done. And they were allowed to sue the company if the company was not doing anything with the company's money. It was something that was implemented by Mitterrand at the beginning of the 80s. Well, he just said, okay, that's finished. So another thing that he did is he reoriented completely the mission of occupational physicians on fitness. Like, are you fit to do this job? Which is very different question from prevention. Because prevention is this job fit to receive a worker? But it's not, is this worker fit to do this job? So yeah, unfortunately, it's not a time of great reform on these topics.
Okay, so, yeah, I was going to say maybe we could just collect the questions.
I'll write them down.
And then
And I'll try and answer
last
quickly.
word, okay?
Yeah.
So,
My questions are just answered. They're very similar to the questions.
okay. Matthew?
Just curious.
Thanks for coming. I'm just curious how do you see your role as a sociologist? Economists often see their role as trying to create the perfect model. Legal experts might say, well, how do we improve the law?
Yeah.
How do you see your role in sort of the advancement of human rights as a sociologist?
We all ask
Yeah.
the last question. Do you have a question? Dan?
So I was struck by your description of how, in the sort of pre-time, right, in the first moral contract, how the workers sort of naturalized the risk that they were undergoing, that they were experiencing, and just treated it as a condition of doing this work that they valued, right? And I wonder to what extent some of the sense of betrayal comes from the fact that this risk wasn't natural in that sense, that it was preventable, and that they could have been given healthier working conditions, whether that comes into play at all or whether they don't understand.
Just getting Kate to be able to run. So I just want to say thank you to both of you for, actually for your transnational solidarity around the solidarity of workers. And I was blown away, Pascal, by your reading about Austin and getting Javier's book, even if what you quoted was from a French sociologist, but really for making it local. And this is leading to a question, because I was sitting here for a lot of the time thinking, oh yeah, France, the United States, everything's the same. Jack's idea or call for so we can have transnational solidarity because workers have the same desires and interests. And that was particularly striking to me, and I hope to some others, because our first speaker, Brishan Rogers, this year, one of the things that he talked about was organizing across national boundaries, but also actually across the different segments of the workforce. And that part wasn't so convincing. So I wanted to go back to where you actually left us. And before doing that, I just want to say, you all weren't saying everything was the same, but the solidarity seemed very similar. But I also, as you were answering questions, more and more the differences in the background rules, even with labor reform, right? The fact that when you were talking about the reform, that sounded similar, but actually that means that what you had a year ago was still very, very different from what we have. So I think just to say for ourselves in our own conversation, like attending to those legal differences would be useful and important, especially personal injury law, but or tort. But to go back to the cross-segment solidarity, since that is where you left us with actually a different kind of division, right? Much greater than a French-American division, but within pretty much every country, and then different, also among different regions. So I wonder if you could say a word about the extent to which you think that kind of solidarity can form. I mean, one answer would be that the primary labor market's going to be gone, so it won't matter. But actually, there will still be some there to think about. So could you answer all three of those questions in 3 minutes?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question. So, how do I define my role as a sociologist? So, I can tell you what I like doing, and then I don't know if it's useful, but let's say, I think sociologists. So I consider myself as a sociologist and historian. I'm more and more adding and historian because sociology without the historical part I find is very, very bland and uninteresting. And I mean, sometimes people speak of the life story method, which I find a bit strange because it's like asking somebody to tell you about his life or her life. That's not a method. I mean, that's just doing history. So, or otherwise we call it oral history. But I consider that, so I have the good fortune of being paid by the state in France in order to do something of public interest. I believe in public service. And this public interest, so I mean, I'm paid by taxpayers' money. And so what I'm doing has to be useful to the general public. One of the things I think which is useful is telling stories that are not out there. People that don't have a say in, I mean, their stories that do not get public is not something that you read about, that you watch on TV, etc. So I try and tell these stories. But then I also try, I consider that, we were speaking about this with Karen the other day, that, as I was saying, indignation is one of the drives behind research. And I consider that good sociology is one which will be able to share a sense of indignation. So, sometimes researchers are attacked by saying you're too engaged in this, you just want to do activist research, serving the cause of these activists, this mobilization, etc. And so that's bad research. And I agree with that often, like that if you do something which is purely instrumental for a mobilization, like for example, if my whole book, the only aim was to help the glass workers get their diseases recognized as occupational diseases, then it would not be a very good book. It would not be a very interesting book. I think it gets better when you say, well, I don't really know what's the goal, what's the objective, but I do share one thing, is I share the sense of indignation. So you go from the same starting point, and then you write something about that, but without doing something instrumental. So that's more or less the way I see things. So it's also some kind of very, very romantic idea that maybe writing books, you can like change things a little bit. And so we're speaking about that with Jack the other day, who was wondering if his book about paper mill workers had changed something for paper workers. So you were pessimistic about it?
Yes. No, they're all mill closed, workers are dying, but one only hopes that somewhere there's an idea that will eventually serve to be a rallying cry for other people.
Yeah.
And that's what we delude ourselves with
Yeah.
thinking.
So yeah, that's it. So it's the idea that what I think sometimes when I'm depressed is like a book will not change much, but all changes that have happened have been because of ideas that are in books. So yeah. So then the second question about the idea of betrayal, because they discover that maybe the risks that they were exposed to were avoidable. So in my story, the first act of betrayal, and the major one, is closing the factory. And that, I mean, I have workers that told me that said, if I'm suing the employer today about asbestos, I mean, the employer, the new employer, but they consider like a kind of continuation of the former one, it's because they had no right to close that factory like that. Well, they say it like that. But then they did some historical research. So I did some, but in fact, my book, as I say on the reverse side of the book, It's an investigation about an investigation. Let's say the investigation was made by the glass workers, by Mercedes Cervantes, and by retired printer who was a communist activist in the area who's very good at doing local history and was able to document a lot of things about what had happened in this factory. And so it's through this research that was done after the closing that they discovered this thing that, oh wow, they knew this. They knew this, and they knew how to prevent it, and they anyway did not tell us. And we thought it was being taken care of. So that's like a kind of a secondary injustice, which they discover after. And I think that that's the major distinction. The distinction is between preventable risk. I mean, what could have been prevented and what could have not. If it's not preventable, then okay, that's part of the job. But if it was preventable and they didn't do it just because they didn't care, or because it was too, I mean, they found it too expensive, or they didn't think about it, or whatever, that's something that they find extremely unfair. So, Karen, about transnational and cross-segment solidarity. So about the transnational thing, of course, yeah, there are many, many differences. Of course, there I stress on what's a bit the same, because I'm trying to show you that maybe this is maybe interesting for you, even though it's a different country. But there are very many differences between France and the United States. And I know that when I came to the United States last year and I discovered that there was something called at-will employment, what's that mean? I said, wow, that really means what it means. At will. So we're not at all at that level yet in France. I can tell you a story very briefly of a glass worker. He told me in the 90s he had to go, so one of the Gival glass workers, he had to go to the United States, to St. Louis, Missouri, to get a machine, which was being sent over to France. So to help like pack it and send it over to France. And you're saying his discovery of the equivalent glassworks, so there was the Owens, Illinois manufacturing in St. Louis, he was stunned. He was saying like, the workers in the United States, they own their tools. So they don't want to lend you them because they bought them with their money. So that he found terrible, that they did not want to lend their tools. And you're saying like they live in like, how do you call that? Mobile homes? Yeah, that's it. Trailers. Yeah, they live in trailer parks. And like that, they can, if they change job, they can take their house and go away. What kind of life is that? So they call it the land of freedom, but it's not the freedom for the worker. So that's what he told me in the interview. But so, about like cross-segment solidarity, I think that's a very, very difficult question. And I mean, you feel the guilt also as, I mean, I have the most secure job in France. So like I have got this life position as a civil servant and I'm paid to write books. So it's very, very, very comfortable. And so maybe they're gonna cancel this one day.
Do you have a sense of solidarity with academics in the United States?
Like, I mean, what I can say is that, so comparing how much I'm paid and how much academics are paid here sometimes, I've seen that I'm paid much less, but I don't always envy the academics here. Like, because I think my life is a bit easier on a lot of topics. But
We're engaged in a common enterprise?
I think, yes, of course. I mean, yeah, because there are the same pitfalls, even in France, as they can be here. And I think that the fact that we have students, and that students bring also like fresh ideas that are not only about your career as an academic and what's the next step, etc., and like remind you why are we doing this, or ask like what do you think the position of the role of a sociologist should be. That's something that there is in common. So, but
They pay us to teach us. They pay to teach us.
yeah, that's well, I mean, in France it's the same, but it's through the, yeah. But so yeah, so cross-segment solidarity is very difficult because, of course, the governments play a lot on the difference of privilege, and so I mean, so.
Some of the students are going to figure it out.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.